The morning sun in August 1945 filtered through the rusted wire fences of the prisoner camp in the northern provinces of the Philippines. A thin mist clung to the ground, carrying with it the scent of ash and damp earth. Beyond the perimeter, the jungle was silent. The war, that relentless engine of destruction, had finally ground to a halt. Inside the compound, rows of wooden barracks stood like tombstones. The paint had peeled long ago. The roofs sagged under the weight of tropical rains. In the courtyard, a group of women stood in formation. Their faces were gaunt, their uniforms torn and faded. They were Japanese civilians, nurses, and support staff who had been captured during the island-hopping campaigns. They had survived malaria, hunger, and the gnawing fear that comes with being forgotten by the world. Captain Daniel Moore stood on a makeshift wooden platform, a sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hand. He was a man of duty, a man who followed orders without question. His voice was firm, almost mechanical, as he read the announcement that had come down from headquarters just 2 days prior. The words felt strange in his mouth, foreign somehow, as if he were speaking a language he barely understood. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. As of this moment, you are all free to go. He expected relief, perhaps even gratitude, maybe cheers or smiles, or at least some acknowledgement that their ordeal had ended. But what followed was nothing he had prepared for. Silence, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the air itself. The wind stopped moving through the palms. The birds ceased their morning songs. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Then, slowly, a tin cup slipped from the hand of a young woman in the front row. It hit the dirt with a dull clang that echoed across the empty space. Her knees buckled. She fell to the ground, her shoulders shaking, and then the tears came, not from one, but from all of them. A wave of sobs rolled through the courtyard like thunder across a distant mountain. Women collapsed into each other's arms. Some covered their faces with their hands. Others stared blankly at the sky, tears streaming down their hollow cheeks, their mouths open in silent cries. Lieutenant Jonathan Hayes stood off to the side, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He had been assigned to guard duty, a role he found increasingly uncomfortable as the days wore on. He had expected celebration, joy, the kind of scenes he had seen in newsreels when Allied prisoners were liberated from German camps. Soldiers lifting children onto their shoulders, families reuniting, flags waving. But this was different. This was grief. He watched as one woman, older than the rest, sank to her knees and pressed her forehead to the dirt. Her body convulsed with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, a place where pain had been stored for too long. Beside her, a younger woman knelt down and wrapped her arms around her, whispering something in Japanese. The words were soft, almost musical, but they carried a weight Hayes could not understand. Moore stepped down from the platform, his face unreadable. He approached Hayes and muttered under his breath, his voice tight with frustration. "Get them organized. We need them out of here by the end of the week." Hayes nodded, but his eyes remained on the women. Something inside him had shifted. For the first time since he had arrived in the Pacific, he began to see the enemy not as a faceless threat, not as the monsters depicted in propaganda posters, but as human beings with hearts that could break. One of the younger women lifted her head. Her name was Yumi. Hayes had noticed her before. She was often the one helping the others, distributing what little food they had, tending to the sick, even when she herself looked ready to collapse. Her eyes met his. They were dark and filled with something he could not name. Not anger, not fear. Something deeper. Something that felt like a question. She spoke in broken English, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, what is freedom when there is nowhere to return to?" Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had never considered that question. Freedom had always seemed like the answer, the end, the goal, the thing they were all fighting for. But now, standing in this courtyard surrounded by weeping women, he realized it was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Freedom without home. Freedom, without family. Freedom that felt more like abandonment than liberation. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the camp. The women remained on the ground, some still crying, others staring into the distance as if trying to see a home that no longer existed. Hayes felt a tightness in his chest. He did not know these women. He did not speak their language. But in that moment, he understood their pain with a clarity that frightened him. Freedom, he realized, was not a gift. It was a question. And for these women, it was a question without an answer. The sound of their weeping followed him as he walked away, a sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The days that followed were strange and heavy. The gates of the camp stood open, unguarded now, the locks removed and tossed aside. But no one left. The women moved through their routines as if nothing had changed. They swept the barracks with makeshift brooms. They tended to the small garden they had managed to cultivate behind the mess hall, coaxing vegetables from the thin soil. They washed their uniforms in buckets of cold water, scrubbing until their hands were raw. Hayes watched them from a distance, puzzled by their behavior. He did not understand why they stayed. Moore had made it clear that they were no longer prisoners. The Red Cross had been notified. Transport ships were being arranged. Papers were being processed. But still, they remained, as if the camp itself had become the only safe place they knew. The camp itself was in a state of decay. The American flag had been raised over the main gate, replacing the tattered Japanese banner that had hung there for years, faded by sun and torn by wind. Soldiers moved through the compound, dismantling fences, clearing debris, boxing up equipment. The war was over, but the cleanup had only just begun. It would take months, perhaps years, to erase the physical scars. The emotional ones would take longer still. One afternoon, Hayes approached the barracks where the women slept. The building was long and low, with a corrugated metal roof that radiated heat like an oven. Inside, rows of cots lined the walls, each covered with a thin blanket. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of sweat and sickness. He found Yumi sitting on the steps outside, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm but distant, as if she were looking at something beyond him. "Why don't you leave?" he asked, his voice gentle. He genuinely wanted to know. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question from multiple angles. "Leave for where, sir?" "Home. Japan. Your family." She smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that did not reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile people wear when they want to protect others from the truth. "My family lived in Hiroshima." The word hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Hayes felt his stomach twist. He had heard the reports, the bombings, the devastation. He had seen the photographs, though censored, of the mushroom cloud rising over the city. He had tried not to think about it, to justify it as necessary, as the only way to end the war without an invasion that would have cost millions more lives. But now, looking at this woman, the justifications felt hollow, empty, like lies he had told himself to sleep at night. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Yumi nodded slowly. "There is nothing to be sorry for, sir. War does not apologize. It simply takes." She stood and walked past him, her bare feet making no sound on the dirt. Hayes watched her go, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He wanted to say something more, to offer some comfort, but he knew there were no words that could fill the void left by an entire city erased from existence. Later that evening, he spoke with Moore in the officers' quarters. The room was small and cramped, with a single desk and 2 chairs. A map of the Philippines hung on one wall, marked with pins and notations. Moore was reviewing paperwork, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "They're afraid to leave," Hayes said, standing in the doorway. "The locals, they blame them. There's already been talk of violence in the villages." Moore leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. He had heard this before, and his patience was wearing thin. "That's not our problem, Lieutenant. Our job is to process them and move them out. What happens after that is up to them. We're soldiers, not social workers." But, no buts. We're not here to babysit the enemy. We won the war. They lost. That's how it works. We give them their freedom, and they figure out what to do with it. That's not on us. Hayes left the office feeling unsettled. He knew Moore was right, in a way. They had their orders. They had done their duty. But something about the situation felt wrong. These women were not soldiers. They had not fired a single shot. They had not committed atrocities. And yet, they were being treated as if they had committed the very crimes that had been inflicted upon them. That night, Hayes could not sleep. He sat outside his tent, staring up at the stars. The jungle was alive with the sound of insects and distant birds. Somewhere, a monkey howled. He thought about Yumi's words. What is freedom when there is nowhere to return to? He thought about the tears in the courtyard. He thought about Hiroshima, about entire families vaporized in an instant. He had no answer, no solution, no way to make sense of it all. All he had was a growing sense that something fundamental had changed inside him. He could no longer see the war in simple terms. Good versus evil. Us versus them. The lines had blurred, and he was not sure they would ever become clear again. The next morning, Hayes found Yumi in the makeshift infirmary. It was little more than a shack with a few cots and a table covered in bandages and medicine bottles. The supplies were limited, mostly leftovers from the American Medical Corps. She was tending to an older woman who lay on one of the cots, her breathing shallow and labored. The woman's face was pale, her skin almost translucent, as if she were slowly fading away. Hayes stood in the doorway, unsure whether to enter. Yumi glanced up and nodded, a silent invitation. He stepped inside, careful not to make too much noise. Her name is Sato Hana, Yumi said quietly, dipping a cloth in a bowl of water. She was a teacher before the war. Mathematics. She taught at a girls' school in Osaka. Now, she is very sick. Hayes looked at the woman on the cot. Her face was lined with age and hardship. She looked fragile, as if a strong wind might carry her away. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved slightly, as if she were speaking to someone only she could see. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked, feeling helpless. Yumi shook her head, placing the damp cloth on Sato's forehead with infinite gentleness. "She needs rest and time. But I do not think she has much left. Her heart is weak. The years here have taken too much." Hayes felt a pang of sadness. He had seen death before, on the battlefield, in the hospitals. But this felt different. This was slow, quiet, almost peaceful. There were no explosions, no screams, no blood, just the gradual dimming of a light that had once burned bright. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice soft. "You could leave. You're free. You could find a ship, try to get home." Yumi continued her work, adjusting the blanket around Sato's frail body. "Because she is still breathing," she said simply. "And as long as she breathes, I will stay. I cannot abandon her now. She has no one else." Hayes was struck by the simplicity of her answer. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just a quiet determination to do what was right, to honor a commitment that went beyond duty or obligation. It was the kind of loyalty he had seen in soldiers on the battlefield, the kind that made men run into gunfire to save a wounded comrade. "You're a nurse?" he asked, wanting to know more about her. "I was. Before the war, I worked in a hospital in Tokyo. The burns unit. We treated factory workers, mostly. Sometimes soldiers. Did you always want to be a nurse?" She paused, her hands stilling for a moment. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. A memory of something long ago. "I wanted to be a painter. I loved watercolors. Landscapes mostly, mountains and rivers. But my father said there was no future in art. He said I needed a practical profession, so I became a nurse instead. Do you regret it?" She looked at him, her eyes thoughtful, searching his face as if trying to determine whether he really wanted to know. "No. I think I think art and healing are not so different. Both try to make sense of pain. Both try to create something beautiful from something broken. Hayes nodded slowly. He had never thought of it that way before. The idea resonated with him, though he could not quite explain why. I have something, Yumi said suddenly. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed and worn, the creases deep from being opened and closed many times. The edges were frayed, as if it had been handled with great care over many years. What is it? Hayes asked, his curiosity piqued. A letter. I wrote it to my fiancé before I was captured, but I never sent it. He was a soldier. He died on Saipan. I learned about it months later, through another prisoner who had heard news from the Red Cross. She handed the letter to Hayes. He hesitated, feeling as though he were intruding on something private, something sacred. But she pressed it into his hands with a gentle insistence. Would you read it to me? She asked, her voice barely audible. In English. I want to hear how it sounds. I want to know if the feelings survive translation. Hayes unfolded the paper carefully, as if it might crumble at his touch. The handwriting was delicate, precise, each character formed with care. He began to read, translating the Japanese characters as best he could, his voice low and steady. My dearest Kenji, the cherry blossoms are blooming again, but I am not there to see them with you. I think of you every day. I wonder if you think of me. I wonder if you are safe. I wonder if you are afraid. I am afraid. But I am also grateful. Grateful that I knew you. Grateful that I loved you. Grateful that, even in this darkness, I can still remember the light. You told me once that love is not about being together. It is about holding someone in your heart even when they are far away. I understand that now. You are always with me. In every breath. In every moment. Until we meet again, I remain yours. His voice faltered at the end. He looked up and saw tears streaming down Yumi's face. But she was smiling, a real smile this time, full of warmth and sadness and something like relief. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It sounds even more beautiful in English, as if the words have traveled across the world and found new meaning. Hayes folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the shallow breathing of Sato Hana and the distant call of a bird outside, its song rising and falling in the morning air. I'm sorry, Hayes said, the words feeling inadequate. For your loss. For everything, Yumi nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. War takes everything, sir. It takes homes and families and futures. But it cannot take memory. It cannot take love. Those things survive, even when everything else is gone. In that moment, Hayes felt something shift inside him. He had spent so long seeing the enemy as a monolith, a faceless threat to be defeated. But now, sitting in this tiny infirmary, listening to a woman mourn the man she loved, he saw the truth. The enemy was just like him, human, fragile, broken, capable of love and loss and everything in between. He reached out and placed his hand on hers, just for a moment. A gesture of solidarity, of shared humanity. She did not pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently, a silent, thank you. On the cot, Sato Hana stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Yumi, then at Hayes, her expression confused. Yumi leaned forward, speaking softly in Japanese, reassuring her. The old woman nodded and closed her eyes again, drifting back into whatever dreams sustained her. Hayes stood to leave, but Yumi called after him. Lieutenant Hayes? He turned. Thank you. For listening. For seeing us. Most people do not want to see. It is easier to look away. Hayes nodded, unable to speak. He left the infirmary with a heavy heart, but also with a strange sense of purpose. He did not know what he could do to help these women, but he knew he had to try. The village beyond the camp was a different world. The locals had suffered under Japanese occupation, and the scars ran deep. Homes had been burned, families torn apart, men taken for forced labor, women subjected to horrors they could not speak of. The arrival of American soldiers had brought hope, but also anger. There were those who wanted justice, and there were those who wanted revenge. One afternoon, a group of villagers gathered near the camp entrance. They carried sticks and stones, their faces twisted with rage. They shouted in Tagalog, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus that echoed through the trees. Hayes could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of pain turned to fury, of grief transformed into violence. Moore ordered the gates to be closed. The women inside huddled together near the barracks, fear etched on their faces. Some clutched each other, their eyes wide. Others simply stood, frozen, waiting for whatever came next. Hayes stood near the fence, his hand resting on his rifle. He did not want to use it, but he would if he had to. "They want blood," one of the soldiers muttered. A young private named Jackson from Tennessee. His face was pale, his knuckles white on his weapon. "They're not getting it," Hayes said firmly, his jaw set. "Why do you care? They're the enemy. Hell, they probably deserve whatever they get." Hayes turned to look at the soldier, his eyes hard. "They're people. They're not soldiers. They didn't choose to be here. And we're not going to stand by and let them be slaughtered." Jackson looked away, uncomfortable. The crowd grew larger. Someone threw a stone. It sailed over the fence and landed near one of the barracks with a dull thud. The women scattered, their cries of alarm piercing the air. A child among them, no more than 10 years old, began to sob uncontrollably. Moore appeared from the command building, his face dark with anger. He assessed the situation quickly, his mind calculating options. "Disperse them," he ordered. His voice clipped. "How, sir?" Hayes asked. "I don't care. Fire a warning shot if you have to. Show them we mean business." Hayes stepped forward, raising his hand. "Let me talk to them first." Moore stared at him, incredulous. "You speak Tagalog now, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. But I can try. Violence will only make this worse. Give me 5 minutes." Moore hesitated, his jaw working. Then he nodded curtly. 5 minutes. Then I'm giving the order to fire over their heads." Hayes walked to the gate. His heart pounded in his chest. He had faced enemy fire before, but this felt different. This was not combat. This was something more primal, more dangerous in its unpredictability. The crowd quieted slightly as he approached, their attention shifting to him. He raised his hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. "I know you're angry," he said, his voice loud and steady, projecting across the open space. "I know you've suffered. I know what happened here. What they did to you, to your families, your villages. And I know you want justice." The crowd murmured. Voices called out in Tagalog, words he could not understand but whose meaning was clear. Anger, accusations, demands. One man stepped forward from the group. He was older, perhaps 60, his face lined with age and pain. His eyes were fierce, burning with a rage that had been building for years. He spoke in broken English, his voice shaking. "They took my son. They burned my village. They killed my wife. Why should they live when my family is dead?" Hayes nodded, acknowledging the man's pain. "I understand, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what you lost. I'm sorry for what happened here. But killing them won't bring your son back. It won't rebuild your village. It won't bring your wife back to life. It will only add more pain to the world. More death, more suffering." The man stared at him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Then what should we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do we live with this?" Hayes had no answer. Not really. But he spoke from his heart. "We find a way to move forward. We find a way to rebuild. We don't forget. We never forget. But we don't let hatred consume us. Because if we do, they've won. The people who started this war, who caused all this suffering, they've won if we become like them." The man's face crumpled. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks. He turned away, his shoulders shaking. The crowd watched him, and something shifted. The anger did not disappear, but it softened, became something else. Grief, perhaps, or exhaustion. Slowly, the man walked away from the gate. The crowd followed, their voices quieter now, the stones falling from their hands. They disappeared back into the jungle, back to their village, leaving only silence behind. Hayes let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. His legs felt weak. Moore appeared beside him, clapping him on the shoulder. "Well done, Lieutenant. But don't think this is over. Hatred doesn't die that easily. It just goes to sleep for a while." Hayes knew he was right. But for now, they had bought time. And time, he was learning, was the most valuable thing they had. As the days passed, arrangements were finalized. A transport ship would arrive at the port in Manila to take the women back to Japan. The Red Cross had coordinated with what remained of the Japanese government, such as it was in the wake of surrender. The women would be repatriated. They would go home, or at least, they would return to Japan, even if home no longer existed. But as Hayes prepared the logistics, organizing transport, requisitioning supplies, coordinating with headquarters, he noticed a change in the camp. The women had begun to clean their barracks more thoroughly. They mended their clothes with thread salvaged from old uniforms. They sang quietly in the evenings, their voices carrying through the still air like ghosts of a world that had been lost. One night, Hayes found Yumi sitting alone near the edge of the compound. She was perched on a fallen log, staring at the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold. The sky looked like it was on fire, the clouds painted in shades of crimson and violet. "Are you ready to leave?" he asked, sitting down beside her on the log. She did not answer right away. She seemed to be gathering her thoughts, choosing her words carefully. "I do not know if I am ready," she said finally, her voice thoughtful. "But I know I must. We cannot stay here forever. This place was never meant to be home. It was always temporary. A place between places. Do you have family in Japan?" "An aunt. In Kyoto. I have not heard from her in years. The last letter I received was in 1943, before the bombing intensified. I do not know if she is still alive. I do not even know if Kyoto still stands. And if she's not, if there's nothing left," Yumi looked at him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "Then I will find a way to live. That is all we can do, sir. We find a way to live. We find a reason to wake up each morning. We find small moments of beauty. We remember those we loved, and we go on. Because the alternative is to give up, and I have not come this far to give up now." Hayes nodded, moved by her quiet strength. He had seen soldiers break under far less strain, yet here was this woman, who had lost everything, still finding the will to continue. "You're very brave," he said. She smiled, a small, sad smile. "I am not brave, Lieutenant Hayes. I am simply tired of being afraid." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world was bathed in darkness. Stars began to appear, one by one, like tiny lights being switched on in the vast emptiness of space. Hayes thought about his own home, about the America he would return to, and wondered if he would ever be able to explain what he had seen here, what he had learned, how he had changed. The night before their departure, the women gathered in the courtyard. Someone had found an old lantern, a dented metal thing that had probably been left behind by a previous occupant of the camp. They lit it, placing it in the center of the circle they formed. The flame flickered and danced, casting long shadows on the walls of the barracks. Sato Hana, though frail and weak, sat among them, wrapped in a thin blanket. Yumi sat beside her, her hand resting gently on the older woman's shoulder. They began to sing. It was a traditional Japanese folk song, slow and mournful, filled with longing and memory. The melody was simple, but it carried the weight of centuries, of generations who had sung these same words in times of joy and sorrow. Hayes stood at the edge of the courtyard, listening. He did not understand the words, but he felt their meaning deep in his bones. It was a song of loss, of hope, of the fragile beauty of life. of home and exile, and the eternal human longing for connection. When the song ended, there was a long silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The flame in the lantern guttered, then steadied. Sato Hana spoke. Her voice was weak, but clear, cutting through the stillness like a bell. "We have survived," she said in Japanese. Yumi translated softly for Hayes, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have endured things that should have broken us. We have seen the worst that humans can do to each other. And yet we are still here, still breathing, still hoping. We must go forward now. We must return to a country that may not welcome us, to homes that may no longer exist. But we must remember those we lost. We must carry their memories with us. And we must live. For them, for ourselves, for the hope that one day the world will be at peace. For the hope that our suffering will mean something." The women bowed their heads, silent tears falling onto their laps. Some clasped their hands in prayer. Others simply closed their eyes, their lips moving in silent words. Hayes felt his own eyes sting. He had never expected to feel this way, to care this much, to be so moved by people he had once been taught to hate. As the lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Hayes understood something profound. War did not end with victory. It did not end with surrender, or treaties, or flags being raised and lowered. It ended with the slow, painful work of healing, with the daily choice to forgive, to remember, to honor the dead while choosing to live. And sometimes, healing required forgiveness. It required seeing the humanity in those who had been called enemies. It required mercy. A young woman began to hum another tune, softer this time, almost like a lullaby. One by one, the others joined in, their voices blending into a single, haunting harmony. Hayes closed his eyes and listened, letting the music wash over him. For a moment, there was no war, no camps, no enemies. There was only this human voices rising together in the darkness, creating beauty from pain. When the singing finally stopped, the women began to disperse, returning to their barracks for their last night in this place. Yumi remained behind, helping Sato to her feet. Hayes approached them. "Can I help?" he asked. Yumi nodded. Together, they guided Sato back to the infirmary. The old woman's steps were slow and unsteady, but she held her head high. When they reached her cot, she looked at Hayes with clear, penetrating eyes. "Thank you," she said in English, the words carefully pronounced. "For your kindness, for seeing us." Hayes swallowed the lump in his throat. "It was an honor," he said, and meant it. Sato smiled, then lay down on the cot. Within moments, she was asleep, her breathing soft and regular. Yumi covered her with a blanket, tucking it gently around her thin frame. Outside, the moon had risen, full and bright. Hayes and Yumi stood in its silver light, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Tomorrow," Yumi said, "everything changes again." "Yes," Hayes agreed. "I do not know if I will ever see you again, Lieutenant Hayes, but I want you to know that you have given me something precious. You have given me hope. The hope that not all people are cruel, that not all soldiers are the same. That kindness still exists in this broken world." Hayes felt a tightness in his chest. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that would convey the depth of what he felt, but words failed him. "You've given me something too," he said finally. "You've reminded me why we fight, not for territory or politics or revenge, but for the possibility that people can be better, that we can choose compassion over cruelty." Yumi reached out and took his hand, holding it for a moment. Her hand was small and warm in his. "Go with peace, Lieutenant Hayes. Go with peace, Yumi." She released his hand and walked back toward the barracks, her figure fading into the shadows. Hayes stood alone in the moonlight, feeling as though something important had ended and something else, equally important, had begun. The convoy left at dawn. 3 trucks, canvas-covered and weather-beaten, Escorted by 2 jeeps with mounted machine guns, they made their way through the winding roads toward Manila, the jungle pressing in on either side, thick and green and alive with hidden things. The women sat in the back of the trucks, their faces pale and tense, clutching their few belongings. Some held hands. Others stared out at the passing landscape, memorizing it, knowing they might never see it again. Hayes rode in the lead jeep, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Moore had warned him that the route was not secure. There were still pockets of resistance Japanese holdouts who had not received word of the surrender, or who refused to believe it. There were also angry locals who might see the convoy as an opportunity for revenge. But they had no choice. The ship was waiting. The schedule had been set. They had to move. The journey was tense. The road was rough, pocked with holes and washed out in places by monsoon rains. The trucks lurched and swayed. Inside, the women held on to the wooden benches, their knuckles white. Yumi sat near the back, her eyes fixed on the receding camp until it disappeared from view. They were halfway to the city when the attack came. It happened fast. A group of men emerged from the jungle, armed with machetes and bamboo spears and a few old rifles. They swarmed the convoy, shouting and striking at the trucks. The drivers slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. Soldiers jumped out, raising their rifles, fingers on triggers. "Hold your fire!" Hayes shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't shoot, unless they attack you directly." But the mob was beyond reason. One man lunged at the first truck, slashing at the canvas cover with his machete. The blade tore through the fabric, and the women inside screamed. Hayes ran toward the truck, his heart pounding like a war drum. "Get back!" he yelled, positioning himself between the attacker and the truck. "Get back now!" The man did not stop. His eyes were wild, filled with a rage that had been festering for years. He raised the machete again, this time aiming at Hayes. Hayes barely dodged, the blade missing his face by inches. He could feel the air move as it passed. He shoved the man back, hard. Using his full weight, the man stumbled and fell to the ground, his weapon flying from his grip. The other soldiers moved in quickly, forming a barrier between the mob and the trucks. They did not fire, but they made their presence known, rifles raised, faces stern. Slowly, the attackers backed off, realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned. They melted back into the jungle like ghosts, their shouts fading into the distance. Hayes leaned against the truck, his hands shaking. His heart was still racing. He looked inside and saw Yumi staring at him, her eyes wide with fear and something else. Gratitude, relief, wonder. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. She shook her head, unable to speak. Hayes climbed into the truck and sat down beside her. The other women watched him warily, unsure what to make of this American soldier who had just risked his life for them. The convoy started moving again, the drivers anxious to put distance between themselves and the ambush site. "Why did you do that?" Yumi asked quietly after several minutes of silence. Her voice was barely audible over the rumble of the truck engine. "Because it was the right thing to do. But we are the enemy." Hayes looked at her, his expression serious, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that surprised them both. "No, you're not. Not anymore. Maybe you never were." Yumi's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and touched his hand. Just for a moment, a gesture of gratitude that transcended language and nation, and all the barriers that war had built between people. "Thank you," she whispered. "You could have let them kill us. No one would have blamed you, but you chose differently. You chose mercy." Hayes nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The convoy rolled on, carrying them toward the sea, toward an uncertain future, toward whatever came next. But in that moment, sitting beside Yumi in the back of that dusty truck, Hayes felt something he had not felt in a long time. Hope, the belief that perhaps, despite everything, humanity had not been entirely lost. The rest of the journey passed without incident. The jungle gave way to farmland, then to small villages, and finally to the outskirts of Manila. The city was in ruins. still bearing the scars of the brutal battle that had taken place there months earlier. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. Streets were lined with rubble, but life was returning. People moved through the streets, rebuilding, reclaiming their city from the ashes of war. The port in Manila was chaos. Ships crowded the harbor, some arriving, some departing, their hulls painted in military gray. Soldiers and civilians moved in every direction, shouting orders, hauling cargo, carrying supplies. Cranes swung overhead, lifting crates from ships. The air smelled of salt and oil and sweat and exhaust fumes. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying out in their harsh voices. The women were led to a waiting area near the docks. It was nothing more than a covered pavilion with wooden benches worn smooth by thousands of waiting bodies. They sat quietly, clutching their few belongings, bundles wrapped in cloth, small bags, letters tied with string. They looked small and lost amid the chaos, like refugees from a world that no longer existed. Hayes stood nearby, watching them, feeling a strange sense of loss, as if something important was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. The ship that would carry them home loomed nearby, a converted troop transport with rust streaks running down its sides. It had carried soldiers to war. Now it would carry survivors home. There was a poetry in that, Hayes thought, though it was a bitter kind of poetry. Yumi approached him, a small bundle in her hands. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing the folded piece of paper, the letter she had shown him in the camp. "I want you to have this," she said, holding it out to him. "Why?" Hayes asked, confused. "This is yours. Your last connection to him, because I want you to send it. Not to Kenji. He is gone. But to his father. He lives in Osaka. His name is Takeshi Yamamoto. I want him to know that his son was loved, that he mattered, that someone remembers him with tenderness. Can you do this for me?" Hayes took the letter, feeling its weight in his hands so light, yet carrying so much meaning. "I'll send it, I promise. I'll find him, and I'll make sure he receives it." Yumi smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes and transformed her face, making her look younger, more like the woman she must have been before the war. "Thank you, Lieutenant Hayes. For everything. For seeing us as human beings. For protecting us. For listening. In this terrible time. You have been a light in the darkness. I will never forget that." Before he could respond, before he could find the words to express what he felt, the call came. A voice over a loudspeaker, announcing in both English and Japanese that the ship was ready to board. The women stood, gathering their things, forming a line. They moved toward the gangplank, a long procession of silent figures in worn clothing, carrying the weight of everything they had endured. Hayes watched as Yumi climbed aboard. She moved slowly, carefully, one hand on the railing. At the top of the gangplank, she turned, looking back at him. She raised her hand in a small wave, her fingers spread wide. Hayes waved back, his heart heavy with emotions he could not name. Sadness, gratitude, respect, a strange kind of love that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with shared humanity. Other women followed. Sato Hana was carried aboard on a stretcher, too weak to walk. She looked even more fragile in the bright sunlight, as if she might disappear at any moment. The younger women helped each other up the gangplank, supporting those who stumbled, encouraging those who hesitated. The ship's horn blared, a deep, mournful sound that echoed across the harbor. Gulls scattered, their cries mixing with the horn's wail. The gangplank was pulled away. Lines were cast off. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the vessel began to move, pulling away from the dock. Water churned white in its wake. Hayes stood on the pier, watching until the ship was nothing more than a speck on the horizon, until he could no longer distinguish its shape from the sky and sea. He stood there long after the other soldiers had left, long after the dock had emptied, long after there was anything left to see. He looked down at the letter in his hand, Yumi's letter, Kenji's letter, a bridge between the living and the dead. He carefully placed it in his jacket pocket, over his heart. He would keep his promise. He would send it. And maybe, in some small way, it would help to heal the wounds that war had left behind. Maybe it would help someone else find peace. As he turned to leave, a voice called out. It was Moore, standing by one of the jeeps. "You all right, Lieutenant?" Hayes nodded, though he was not sure it was true. "Yes, sir. Just saying goodbye." Moore studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "They got to you, didn't they? Those women." Hayes met his gaze steadily. "They reminded me of something I'd forgotten, sir, that the enemy is human too, that war doesn't have to destroy everything, that there's still room for mercy." Moore was quiet for a long moment. Then he clapped Hayes on the shoulder. "Maybe you're right. Maybe that's the real victory, not defeating the enemy, but remembering our own humanity. Come on. Let's go home." They climbed into the jeep and drove away from the harbor, leaving the sea behind. But Hayes carried the letter with him, and with it, a piece of everything he had learned. Months later, Hayes found himself back in the United States. The war was over, officially and finally. The parades had been held, the celebrations had faded, the soldiers had come home, but the world was still broken, still trying to piece itself back together. He returned to his hometown, a small city in Ohio, where the streets were tree-lined and the houses had white picket fences. Everything looked the same, but he felt different. Changed in ways he was still trying to understand. He had carried Yumi's letter with him across the Pacific, through processing centers and debriefing sessions, through the long journey home. He had kept it safe, protected it like a sacred thing. Now, sitting in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by familiar objects that seemed to belong to a different life, he knew it was time to fulfill his promise. He sat down at his desk, the same desk where he had done his homework as a boy, where he had written letters to his parents from boot camp. He carefully addressed an envelope, using the address Yumi had given him. Takeshi Yamamoto, Osaka, Japan. He included a note of his own, written in careful English and translated by a friend who had studied Japanese before the war. "Dear Mr. Yamamoto, my name is Jonathan Hayes. I was an American soldier stationed in the Philippines. I met a woman named Yumi, who knew your son, Kenji. She asked me to send you this letter. She wanted you to know that your son was loved and remembered, that his life mattered, that he was a good man who fought with honor. I am sorry for your loss. I hope this letter brings you some measure of comfort. Respectfully, Lieutenant Jonathan Hayes." He sealed the envelope, walked to the post office, and mailed it. Then he waited, not expecting a response, but hoping for one nonetheless. Weeks passed. Winter came, covering Ohio in snow. Hayes tried to readjust to civilian life, but it was difficult. He found work at a local factory. He reconnected with old friends, but he felt disconnected, as if he were watching his own life from a distance. The things that had once seemed important, football games, dances, gossip about neighbors, now felt trivial. He had seen too much, learned too much, changed too much. Then, one cold morning in January, a letter arrived. It was written on thin paper, the handwriting shaky but legible. It had been translated into English by someone who knew both languages well. "Dear Lieutenant Hayes, I received your letter, and with it, the words my future daughter-in-law wrote to my son. I cannot express what this means to me. When Kenji died, I thought all memory of him would die too. I thought he would be forgotten, just another name among millions. But you have shown me that he was not forgotten, that he was loved, that his life touched another person's heart. This gives me great comfort in my grief. You have given me a gift I never expected, the gift of knowing that my son mattered, that his love was real, that someone, somewhere, remembers him with tenderness. I do not know what happened to Yumi. I hope she survived. I hope she found peace. And I hope you have found peace as well. War makes enemies of people who should have been friends. But your kindness shows me that not all is lost, that humanity survives even in the darkest times. Thank you, Lieutenant Hayes. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for honoring my son's memory. May peace find you. Takeshi Yamamoto. Hayes read the letter 3 times, tears blurring his vision. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with Yumi's original letter. These pieces of paper, these fragile artifacts of love and loss, became his most treasured possessions. They were proof that something good had survived the war. That connection was possible even across the deepest divides. He sat for a long time, staring out the window at the snow-covered street, thinking about the women in the camp, about Yumi and her quiet strength, about Sato Hana and her dignified suffering, about the tears they had shed when they were told they were free. Freedom, he realized, was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of something else, something harder. The work of rebuilding, of forgiving, of moving forward while carrying the weight of memory. It was the daily choice to hope despite everything, to believe in the possibility of peace despite having known war, to see humanity in those who had been called enemies. Years passed. Hayes married a woman named Margaret, a nurse who understood something of what he had seen because she had seen her own horrors in military hospitals. They had 2 children, built a life, created a home filled with laughter and love. But Hayes never forgot. He kept the letters in his study, in a wooden box on a high shelf. Sometimes, late at night, he would take them out and read them, remembering. He told his children about the war, but not in the way most veterans did. He did not talk about battles or victories. He talked about the women in the camp, about Yumi and her letter, about the tears shed when freedom was announced, about the humanity he had found in the most unexpected place. War teaches us to hate, he told his son when the boy was old enough to understand. But peace teaches us to remember that we are all human, that suffering knows no nationality, that mercy is the highest form of courage. His daughter asked him once if he had ever been afraid during the war. Every day, he answered honestly. But the greatest fear was not of dying. It was of losing myself, of becoming so hardened that I could no longer feel compassion. The women in that camp saved me from that. They reminded me why it's important to remain human, even in inhuman circumstances. As the decades passed, Hayes became known in his community as a voice for reconciliation. He spoke at schools and churches, always emphasizing the importance of seeing the humanity in others, even former enemies. He corresponded with peace organizations. He supported efforts to build bridges between nations. He never claimed to be a hero. He saw himself as someone who had simply tried to do the right thing in an impossible situation. One day, when Hayes was much older, his hair silver and his steps slower, he visited a museum dedicated to peace and reconciliation. It had been built in Washington to commemorate the end of the war and to honor those who had suffered on all sides, a controversial idea at first, but one that had gained acceptance as the years passed and wounds slowly healed. As he walked through the exhibits, leaning on a cane, his grandchildren beside him, he came across a photograph that stopped him in his tracks. It was mounted on a wall under soft lighting, part of an exhibit about prisoners of war and the aftermath of conflict. It was the women from the camp. They stood in the courtyard, their faces gaunt and sad, their eyes haunted. The caption read, "Japanese women, prisoners of war, liberated August 1945, Philippines." Many of these women wept upon hearing they were free, facing an uncertain future in a destroyed homeland. Hayes stared at the photograph for a long time, his vision blurring with unshed tears. He could see Yumi in the back, her face turned slightly away from the camera, her hand resting on someone's shoulder. He could see Sato Hana, seated on the ground, her expression distant. He could see all of them, frozen in that moment of uncertain freedom, captured forever by an unknown photographer who could not have known the story behind those tears. His granddaughter tugged at his sleeve. "Grandpa, are you okay?" He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he placed his hand on the glass that protected the photograph, as if he could reach through time and touch them, tell them that their suffering had not been forgotten, that their story mattered. A young woman approached. She wore a museum badge identifying her as a guide. Her name tag read Sarah. "Did you serve in the war?" she asked gently, noticing his attention to the photograph. Hayes nodded, finding his voice. I did. In the Pacific. I knew these women. I was there when they were freed. Sarah's eyes widened. Really? That's incredible. Would you be willing to share your story? We collect oral histories from veterans and survivors. Hayes looked at the photograph again, at those faces he had never forgotten. Yes, he said. I think it's time. They sat in a quiet room, a recording device between them. Hayes told the story, the announcement, the tears, the camp, Yumi and her letter, Sato Hana's quiet dignity, the attack on the convoy, the ship leaving the harbor. He spoke for over an hour, his voice steady, his memory surprisingly clear for events that had happened so long ago. Why do you think they cried? Sarah asked when he finished. Why tears instead of joy? Hayes thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because freedom without home is not really freedom, it's exile. These women had survived the war only to discover that the world they knew was gone. Their families might be dead. Their cities might be destroyed. They were free to return to nothing, free to start over with nothing. That's why they cried. Not from sadness, exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of having to rebuild their entire lives from ashes. And what did you learn from them? Hayes smiled, a sad, wise smile that came from decades of reflection. That the enemy is just a word we use to make killing easier. That beneath uniforms and flags and propaganda, we're all human. We all love. We all suffer. We all hope for a better future. Those women taught me that the real victory in war is not defeating the enemy. It's refusing to let war destroy your humanity. It's choosing compassion when cruelty would be easier. It's remembering that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of mercy. Sarah was quiet for a moment, moved by his words. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing this. Hayes stood, preparing to leave, but he turned back to look at her. Freedom doesn't begin with victory, he said. It begins with forgiveness. That's what those women taught me, and I've spent my whole life trying to honor that lesson. That evening, Hayes stood on the museum steps with his grandchildren, watching the sun set over the city. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gold, just like it had been on that evening in the Philippines so many years ago when he had sat with Yumi and watched the day end. His grandson, a boy of 12 with curious eyes, looked up at him. Grandpa, do you think there will ever be a world without war? Hayes considered the question seriously, the way he always did with his grandchildren. He never talked down to them or offered easy answers. I don't know, he said honestly. But I know that every time someone chooses mercy over vengeance, we get a little closer. Every time someone sees the humanity in their enemy, we move in the right direction. It's slow work, generational work, but it's the most important work there is. Did you ever see Yumi again? The woman from the camp? Hayes shook his head. No, I never did. I don't know what happened to her. Whether she found her aunt. Whether she rebuilt her life. Whether she ever painted those watercolors she dreamed of. But I like to think she survived. That she found a way to live. That somewhere, she's telling her own grandchildren about the importance of hope. Do you miss her? Hayes smiled. I miss what she represented. The possibility that even in the darkest times, human kindness can survive. That we're capable of more than violence and hatred. That redemption is always possible if we're willing to reach for it. They walked down the museum steps together, 3 generations bound by love and the stories they shared. The city lights were beginning to come on, glowing in the gathering darkness. Somewhere, Hayes knew, other people were telling other stories, passing on other lessons, building other bridges between past and future. The war had ended 80 years ago, but its lessons remained. They lived in the memories of those who had been there. They lived in the stories passed down through families. They lived in museums and books and photographs of women crying when they were told they were free. And they lived in the hearts of people like Hayes, who had learned the hard way that the greatest victory is not defeating the enemy, but refusing to become one. That true courage is not found in violence, but in the choice to show mercy when mercy is not deserved. That freedom is not given but built, piece by piece, act by act, moment by moment, by people who choose hope over despair, forgiveness over vengeance, love over hate. As Hayes walked into the evening with his family, he carried with him the memory of that August morning in 1945, the women in the courtyard, the tears falling like rain, the sound of Yumi's voice asking a question that had no easy answer. What is freedom when there is nowhere to return to? He had spent his whole life answering that question. And the answer, he had come to understand, was this. Freedom is the choice to begin again, to rebuild from ruins, to plant gardens in the ashes, to remember the dead while choosing to live, to forgive the unforgivable, to hope for the impossible. It was the choice Yumi had made when she stayed to care for Satohana, the choice the women had made when they sang together on their last night in the camp, the choice Takeshi Yamamoto had made when he chose to thank an enemy soldier for honoring his son's memory. And it was the choice Hayes himself had made, every day since, to live in a way that honored what those women had taught him about courage, dignity, and the indestructible nature of the human spirit. The sun had set completely now. Stars were appearing in the darkening sky, one by one, like promises of light in the darkness. Hayes looked up at them, thinking of all the people across the world looking at those same stars, all of them hoping for the same things: safety, love, peace, home. Come on, he said to his grandchildren, his voice warm. Let's go home. And they walked together into the night, carrying with them the stories that would outlive them all, the lessons that would echo through generations, the hope that one day the world might finally learn what those crying women and the soldier who protected them had understood, that we are all, in the end, simply human beings trying to find our way home.